Hello, everyone, and welcome to this virtual panel discussion about restoring the trust in science. And it's, for me at least, it's quite an interesting topic to have a discussion on, considering we're in the middle of a pandemic. You would have thought that trusting scientists and key opinion leaders and experts would be a given, but vast swathes of the public are still questioning the science. And right from the very beginning of this pandemic, we had views that COVID was given to you by 5G masts, or that the whole pandemic was designed to rearrange the world order. We had claims that scientific processes were not being followed properly in drug development and corners were being cut. And we also had claims, once the drugs were released, that they were controlling your mind, or that they were tracking your movements, which is pointless, considering we have phones to track our movements and the media to control us already. So we have this really interesting discussion today. We are going to slant it slightly towards how conferences can support us in addressing this issue and restoring trust in science. And to do so, we're joined virtually by David Worlock, who is co-chair at Outsell, and their leadership program. We're joined by my colleague Emma Hennessey from Morressier, and Dr. Benoit Chabot from the University of Sherbrooke. So thank you ever so much for joining us. So we have several questions. We've got 30 minutes, and we may well use all of that time. So I'll try and keep us to track. The first question, really, I'm going to direct firstly to you, Benoit. Have we lost trust in science, or is it just that science is more open these days for people to question?
Yeah, that's the excellent question. I think that we have a feeling that trust may have been lost. Trust in science, I would distinguish science with scientific institution, because I don't think that trust in science has been lost. I think it's actually probably increased based on surveys that I've seen over the last 2 years. The public has maintained its trust in science. Trust in scientific institution, or let's say big pharma. The moment you're talking about big pharma doing science, you have this commercial aspect to it that contaminates it a little bit.
Yes.
Or you can have the trust in institution like the World Health Organization, or American Food and Drug Administration. Because of the politicization that has occurred, people are regarding now the science associated with these things as maybe compromised.
Yeah.
But I think trust is fine. We have the impression that it's being eroded in part because of the way the media maybe treats situations.
Yeah.
You can have 100 people having one opinion and one people having a different opinion, and they will have equivalent time to express their divergent opinion.
Yes.
And that is not really reflecting the status of confidence of science. It's just giving the ability of people to express their opinion. So I think that it's a good process to have this possibility of explaining different opinion, but science by itself is subject to mistrust. Maybe when you learn a little bit about it, how it works, it's a messy process. It takes time. Opinions are changing. People are adapting, and if you're looking for a proof, I mean, the scientists are the last people who are going to say, this is how it works, that's the proof. They're always leaving a margin of error.
Yep.
They try to understand, incorporate all the data, and the process is very important. And that's, I guess, what may be eroding a little bit the science sometimes.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting as well. So often you see politicians standing up and talking alongside scientists. So you reckon it's that merge that's maybe causing the distrust?
Yes, they're using they're using the privilege of having a scientist maybe that knows what it talks about to boost their politics.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's an interesting take. And I was going to put this then to Emma. Working for an early stage research publisher and having a background working for large academic publishers, How do you view this? How do you view whether the trust has been lost over the last 2 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo a lot of what Benoit said, which is that I have seen the same surveys and research that show that the level of trust is increasing rather than decreasing, but there's all these other things that are getting in the way. And I think we had a brief email exchange among the panelists, and someone made the point that part of the sort of problem, especially with sharing early stage research like conference content or preprints, but I think it's true about science in general, is that the average person, I mean, I think a lot of us, at least in the US, we learned about the scientific process in middle school, but you don't really touch on that again in life unless you enter a scientific or science adjacent field. And so I think that there are so many things sort of getting in the way of the basic question of if it's trustworthy. So the politicization of it, I think, is huge, as well as just a lack of familiarity with it's interesting because science affects all of us every day, but I think a lot of people didn't really think about it that much until they were really confronted with it by the pandemic.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting answer. So I suppose there's always been that sort of confusion around science, but this has really brought it out in people that how little they perhaps do know about the processes over the last few years. Yeah, no,
Right.
interesting. And David, what's your thoughts on this?
Um, Trust has several components to me. Identity is the first. You have to know who's speaking and what he's saying, even in a scientific context, in order to evaluate the views. So anything which helps those inquiring, whether they're lay people or journalists or other scientists, anything which helps them to demonstrate provenance, where it came from and how it came together, that is of vital importance to me. The other part, of course, is peer review. I have severe doubts about our current processes of peer review, but the community of scientists is the best judge of the value of science and the trustworthiness of science. I'm always surprised by how seldom we publish results which simply demonstrate that a previous experiment was correct. How reproducibility is becoming a strong issue, but we very seldom publish reproducibility statistics and demonstrate what is solid science through identification of science that's repeatable. So in the States, I noticed a huge reaction to the way journalists have gone to preprint servers and created sensational headlines. That will go on being the case until we ourselves in scholarly communications can demonstrate provenance and peer group approval, it seems to me.
No, yeah, very interesting, very interesting. Did you want to add anything to that? You were
No,
nodding along.
I'm very sensitive to this argument. I think it's an excellent point, the reproducibility of the of experiments that it can be problematic sometimes. But I try to comfort myself by saying that if it's important, if the result is important, if the study is important, people will maybe not reproduce the result, but they will say, if this is true, then that means I can go to the next step.
Yeah.
And then it will progress or it will stop there. But you will never, maybe not find the reproducibility yet, but if it's important, somebody will pick it up somewhere. It's going to be confirmed or infirm if it's important.
Yeah.
But I agree that it would be a nice way of having a format somewhere to publish when things are difficult to reproduce, to have this ability to contest and discuss those results by a group of scientists.
Yeah. So I agree, and I was also going to pick up on David's point as well about preprint servers and media grabbing those headlines straight away. And in the UK, I don't know if anyone's ever seen the Daily Mail, but there's something that's going to kill you absolutely every day due to some study they picked up somewhere that tends not to have been peer reviewed. So that's a really interesting point. And Emma, the next question to you really, especially from an early stage research publisher and a conference provider, what can we do to change the scientific as scientific and academic organisations to change the perception of science by creating more impactful conferences?
Yeah, so I think when I was thinking about this question, for me, I kept coming back to the idea that I think one of the huge problems that I see in sort of the divide between the general public and the scientific community is one that we've been grappling with for like as long as humans have been around, probably, but really over the last couple of years, which is that a lot of people don't see themselves when they see a scientist. They view the scientific community as sort of being separate from them. And like I said, I think it's sort of similar to the point I was making before, that I think a lot of people didn't really think much about science in their day-to-day lives until they sort of started to feel like they had to. And so I had a few thoughts about ideas that conference organizers could think about when planning their conferences. So this whole "I don't see myself when I see a scientist" idea is definitely tied to DE&I. So people tend to listen to people who look like them, sound like them. And I think that virtual and hybrid conferences have an important place here because they open participation globally, both for presenters, participants. I'm not suggesting that everyone's friends and family are going to start attending the conferences, but I just feel like whatever image of a conference does get out into the world, we've talked about the media, obviously, there's certain types of media that attend conferences. There's often local news about big conferences coming to town. And I think the more that people can sort of see something in that they can relate to will help a lot. Another thing I was thinking about is most of my career before starting at Morressier has been in journal publishing. And I once met someone who told me that he peer reviewed a paper for every paper that he submitted for publication. And the reason for that is, for those who are not familiar with the peer review process, finding peer reviewers is always a pain point for journal editors. And this person sort of felt like contributing to the same level that he was benefiting from that system would be helpful. And I think that there are ways that conference organizers can do this in a couple of ways. One is, I think that scientific advocacy and communication with the public needs to become more of like a day-to-day activity in whatever way works for people who are doing research. And so it can't be a like once a year I go to the middle school. I mean, that's great. And I think that obviously children are the future and they're a huge part of this, but I think it needs to become sort of like a more regular part of doing science. And I think that that's tied to a couple things. One is recognition. Like, scientists are not formally recognized for those types of activities. So I've talked to some societies in the past who have tried to think about ways to do that. You could also tie it to sort of maybe like a fun element of a conference. Like, I'm not suggesting like you don't get your lunch until you tell us what you've done for science advocacy this week, but maybe like a competition. Maybe I'm displaying too much of like what motivates me in my life, but I think that there are different ways that you can kind of incorporate it into the daily life of the conference. And then just quickly, another sort of related example is, I don't know if we have anyone here from ASLO, the Association for the Sciences of Limnology and Oceanography, but I've never actually worked with this organization, but they're a Wiley publishing partner. And something that has always stayed with me is that a few years ago, they held their annual meeting in Puerto Rico. And as part of the annual meeting, they provided hands-on help to restore marine and coastal resources that were damaged during Hurricane Maria. And I see that as like a huge thing that scientists can do at conferences specifically, because I think that sometimes local people in a community just have this sense like the conference sweeps into town, there's all these people in the restaurants, and then they just sweep out. And they don't really see any benefit besides, economic, which is important, but it's not the whole thing. And then I think I think it's also important to find genuine ways to tie all of this work to relationships with trustworthy news sources to kind of get the word out. Because, like I said, we can't expect the public to be coming to the conferences, but I think that we just want them to become more familiar with them and what they do and what scientists do. So, those are just a few thoughts that I had about how you can really bring this to life in a conference setting.
No, that's fascinating as well to mention bringing in. Because in the publishing world, they're bringing in lay summaries, patient lay summaries, more plain language workings, infographics, author videos that are much more simple in explaining how the scientific process works. And it makes much more sense, of course, that conferences mirror those publications as well, so that even the early stage research is much more understandable. And the patient outreach is one step, but then getting the general public involved as well is a great idea on top of that. And David, I saw you nodding along on a monitor. Did you have anything to add to those comments?
Well, yes, I wanted to say that, of course, emerging from the world of print, the science journal is a sort of industry unto itself and a discrete activity, but it is not. In terms of the lives of scientists, and I hope Benoit will agree with this, the whole chain of activity which goes from grant application through early stage research and results and the conference proceedings that we've been talking about, right the way through to preprint, possible publication, and then impact and dissemination work. And I love the idea that as we develop better impact and dissemination work, so we will formulate better ways of describing the message of the research so that journalists and others don't have to make it up for themselves. Then it seems to me that's a whole chain of human activity which deserves, in a digital age, to be something which can be navigated by any interested inquirer from end to end. And that gives you increased trust because you then meet the scientist at several stages of his development. But I pause at one point. Some science is wrong. Some articles are fallacious. We have a retraction system. To me, one of the sad things is that journal retractions, except on the Retraction Watch site, are not all grouped together. And it is possible to go into a database and read an article which has been retracted without knowing that it was retracted. And trust does depend upon dealing properly with things like that.
That's really interesting. Thanks for that. And Benoit, I imagine that rings.
No, I agree with what David pointed out, and I agree with Emma as well, because for example, in my institution, just to increase the popularization of science and help, we're training the new generation of scientists, and we were telling them, be aware of the public. Try to get your elevator pitch, your 2 minutes of explaining of a paper, of your science, of your project. Imagine you're talking to your parents. We do competition. People present comic strips to express ideas or to express concepts. And that is what is coming. And I think there's a desire from the scientific community to increase the overlap with the general public on that. And then later in their career, I think scientists should be more appreciated, should be invited. You should make them work harder. Actually, invite them at variety of meetings. They could be after dinner speakers. They could be and they would be happy talking about their career
Yeah, cool.
and the process of scientific research.
Yeah.
Not the vocabulary, the very difficult thing to understand. They have nice story to tell. They're people like others. They have challenges and grants and everything, like David said. And some have very interesting story of discoveries, how the process works, and that is going to contribute to the to increase trust in science and increase the.
Yeah, oh, that's fantastic. So I'm trying to bring in all of these ideas as much as I possibly can, but I suppose making everything more accessible and clear from the earliest of stages is the sort of overarching goal, I suppose, here. So with that in mind, now that conference posters and early stage research are increasingly being made available online and often without vigorous peer review, especially in that early stage research phase, is there a danger that making this content accessible to the public will impact trust? And David, I'll go to you on this, I think, first, because this was what you were touching on a moment ago, I think.
Well, first of all, I want to say, if Benoit is ever an after-dinner speaker anywhere, can I go along? I think he's very lucid, and I would like to have that pleasure. Yes, this question of peer review, I think we're going to mature into different ways of handling this. You see, I talked about the opinion of a peer group. And I think one thing which our metrics have let us down on is that they are formulated in the world of print and reflect some very measurable things, and sometimes not always the measurable things are the things which tell you what the worth is of the thing that you've measured. For example, we are still very dependent upon impact factors and upon searching citations and citation indexing. This seems to me perfectly acceptable in one sense. It's our inheritance. But in another sense, if we're going to have this wider span of information running right across the processes of science, then we need to know, as we go along, what the groupthink is on how distinguished or undistinguished that progress is, and we need to have a way of scoring it. We need to have a different sort of metric, accumulating metric, which shows us how people are reacting to the way in which this research is rolling out and rolling on. A lifelong way as well. There are 2 Nobel Prize winners in physics this year in their 80s, whose major publications were in the late 1960s and 1970s. Papers which are seen as vitally important today, but which sank pretty well without trace for a decade or more. Sometimes science has to catch up, and our way of scoring it has to reflect that. And I think we're in a real difficulty there. We need to invent a new metric, and we can't get off the old one quite yet. How the science community is going to do that, I don't quite know. But I look every day for signs that people are beginning to develop new measures.
That is I think the billion-dollar question, I suppose. And Benoit, any thoughts from you?
Well, I want to come back. I agree with that statement, but I want to come back to whether we should, how should we prepare the meetings that present preliminary data?
Yeah.
I mean, there may be proposition to be more restrictive and to be more careful about what is presented. And I'm not in this category. I would prefer to have almost complete freedom in what is presented. I think there is an element, well, first there's an element of teaching. A lot of students attend these conferences. They may be presenting things that are slightly unprepared. They're preliminary. By definition, they're preliminary. They are presented not as truth, but as preliminary, and they should be treated as such.
Yeah.
And sometimes the media don't take They see this as unvalidated science, but they present it as truth. And that should be careful about this. But that's how science works. The networking, the communication. People will say, this is too early, but that's interesting. Maybe we should do something together. Or your experiment is not, you should do this particular experiment. If you want to convince me, you have to do this experiment.
Yeah.
If you remove all this and you present only the confirm, then I don't need to go to meeting because it's probably a paper that's going to come out next week. I don't need to go to the meeting to see these results anymore. I'll see it.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really interesting one to have because, and it goes back to the previous point, I suppose, as well, is that you want to make everything as transparent as early on as possible, but you have to label everything very clearly to make sure that people are aware that it is preliminary. And to David's earlier point, you don't want the Daily Mail picking it up and presenting it as fact. Perfect. Now, we are running out of time slightly, so I'm going to skip to our final question, which was, how can we best educate the public to ensure that they have a better understanding of the scientific process, of how studies work, clinical trial processes work in drug and vaccine developments and so on, and how pre-published research can be vetted and reviewed?
Yeah. We've already mentioned a few things. I mean, the contribution has to be from the scientist. If we're training them to be more open, to be more collaborating, to talk to the public more, that's already a step. That's a challenge. Yeah. And then the public as well, or meetings like this, must also do their share of the work by inviting the scientists, asking them to make contribution on a regular basis, so that they understand what the life of a scientist is, are the challenges, and foster the discussion between these groups. Yeah.
No, I agree. And David, thoughts on that?
Well, we already have a concern about science policy. When we have professors like Jim Al-Khalili here in the UK, who is a professor of public knowledge of science. So his business is about educating the public. We have certain efforts in that direction. Yet I do not know that we do enough to educate journalists. I do wish that there was a Howard Hughes seminar for medical journalists, that there was a Wellcome Trust session for life sciences journalists. There is a huge amount to be done, not just in telling journalists, in giving journalists advice on how to build their view of these things, but about the sources. And I suspect that most journalists who read archive or another preprint server for a story wouldn't know how to research early stage research or anything else. So I think our first education job is to educate the intermediaries, and then to move towards the general public.
Yeah, and that's really interesting that you say that, because obviously with journal publications you have entire committees built around ethics and the correct way to publish. But for preprints and early stage research, there's not so much of that guidance and advice out there, especially when it gets to the mass media and into social media. That's an excellent point. And Emma, coming from a publisher's background, how would you view this for the earlier stage research as well?
I mean, I was thinking sort of similar things, that it's important to start with the news media, and maybe it goes back to the recognition thing that I mentioned earlier. I just thought of it, so it's not like fully well thought out, but maybe there's a way that scientists can receive formal recognition in their tenure and review processes for collaborating with journalists, for example. That's something that's trackable, so it feels like something that could work. So I'll have to think more on it and maybe do a part 2. But I think that that's so much of it, because in order to get to the public, we have to get to where they are, and they're reading the newspaper, whatever it is they're reading, rather than attending conferences. So I agree that that's the place to start. But scientists are incredibly busy and overworked, and so we have to find a way that works for them to incorporate that into their lives.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. We've got 20 seconds to go, I'm seeing on the countdown, so we're bang on time. So Emma and David, thank you for joining us virtually, and Benoit, thanks for making the travel all the way from Canada.
You're welcome.
For this, and I think it's been a lovely discussion to talk about how we can restore trust in science and help educate the public on the processes. So thank you ever so much. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.